Hello, Mage fans. This is Adam Simpson with Mage the Podcast, and I'm joined today by the redoubtable Terry Robinson. You there with us, Terry?
I am. Are you ready to talk about things?
I've got a few things to talk about. We're talking about the next episode of the Tomes of Magic series. Today we're talking about Convention Book Iteration X, and this would be the first one, which I'm pretty sure was 1994. It's got a number 9 on the spine. It was written by Chris Hind. There's also Sotiros Brocato mentioned in the credits back when he used a different name. It clocks in at 72 pages. And before we get to this, there is something I just have to mention. Terry, we were going to start this podcast at 7 o'clock and 0 seconds. And by my chronometer, you are 2 seconds late. This is going to go on your record. We are going to discuss this after the episode. And speaking of that, it leads in well to the description of Iteration X as being the Clockwork Convention, because they are so zeroed in on, hyper-focused on details, schedules, getting it right, avoiding mistakes, and so many other things. So, Terry, what was your overall thoughts on this book?
This book aged vastly better than I remembered. In my head, I remember reading Iteration X revised and the excerpts from Technocracy Assembled and seeing the state of the tradition then. They'd thrown off the shackles of the machine during the Avatar War. And I think I just projected back how bad a lot of the technocracy stuff was in first edition. But I do think they do. This feels like the first book where the pivot of the technocracy to humanize it a bit, to say that if they are the bad guys, it's because the world needs that bad guy to do something useful rather than them just being flat out the bad guys. So there were some surprising moments of humanity. The tone wasn't quite consistent entirely throughout. It goes back and forth between a convention full of Terminators and a convention full of people that are trying to make sure that everyone has access to quality prostheses. But I was pleasantly surprised with how much of a step out of first edition this book seemed to have been making.
Yeah, I saw a lot of good material here, some of which I truly did not remember from when I read it. Trying to think, probably 20 years more back. And so it was nice to bring that out. Some of the things here really, jump out as this is early first edition and deal with it. But there were other things that gave me food for thought and made me think, this is something I can work with and something I like to see. Now, before we go through some of the sections of the book, how it's broken down, just wanted to mention that as I was reading this, I was comparing that to the first Progenitor Convention book, which we did an episode for not too long ago. And I remember how there was some discussion about how Progenitors Convention book had a pretty clunky, perhaps even somewhat awkward view of technomagic, and how at the time we were saying, well, this may just be an example of early first edition. The people at Whitewolf were still getting their sea legs on and trying to figure out how to approach this. But it occurred to me that there was a mechanics change somewhere in late first edition, perhaps early second edition, that Brocato brought to the table, and that really changed a lot of our thinking about technomagic and Magetheascension. In the early days and before Brocato's tenure, technomagic and arcane magic were 100% equal in the rules. The way that foci were used, the way that you incurred paradox or the difficulty of pulling off an effect, or the likelihood of a sleeper noticing that something strange is going on was 100% equal in the rules. And so I think that led to the writers portraying technomagic as clunky or odd sometimes in a deliberate attempt to make sure that they were sticking to the rules and saying, look, all magic is hard, all magic is outside of the box, and all magic has potential for trouble. And it was Brocato who brought in that qualitative difference and said to everybody, look, let's think about this. Technomagic is in line with the dominant paradigm, and that is going to have an effect on how sleepers perceive it and how it works on Main Street in a big city. And so he changed rules for foci and a couple of other things. And I think that kind of set the stage and helped us all to get a better grip on how to portray technomagic differently from arcane magic.
This was the first book where it seemed really obvious that the idea of magic could be used to enhance other abilities roles outside of combat. where a lot of the rotes in the rote section very much focus on this is a magical effect that will add to the successes when you do this mundane ability, which will allow you to have that superhuman Terminator, technocratic, android level of precision and success that this convention is going for. And I feel like that was kind of the first shift, where it would have sections where, okay, using this matter one effect or using this mind one effect allows you to get into a zone or harness your tools in a new way that will give you extra successes when doing this mundane role, allowing you for a level of success that most mundanes aren't going to be able to do. So yeah, I kind of noticed the same pivot or this same move.
Yeah, I saw that as an application of the new optional rules introduced in the book number 7, the first Mage Player's Guide. I remember some mention of that there, and this was the first time it was actually brought in and applied in a supplement after that. And yeah, it was good to see that some of Bricato's ideas were taking hold and finding expression in the books. Also, before we get into the sections, this really looks to me like the first book where they brought in alternate terminology for technomagic versus arcane magic. For example, call it an apparatus instead of calling it a focus. Call it a device with a capital D instead of a talisman, which would later be called a wonder. And I don't know if Chris Hind gets the credit for introducing this, but we actually have a glossary towards the back of the book laying out technomagic terms. And so as far as I can tell, this was the beginning of that trend, which became quite popular and a lot of fun to use in the game.
One of the things that I very much like about M20 is small changes in vernacular lead to large changes in thinking that can lead to some very flavorful mechanics. The more and more I think about it, the more and more I love primal utility as an alternative to the prime sphere. And the more and more you think about that, there was a fellow on a person on the Mage Whitewolf fora who was talking about, I guess it was the Onyx Path fora, that was mentioning he has a primal connection sphere that anyone with a tradition that focuses heavily on community and community building can access. So the choristers in his game have a primal connection sphere focusing on the quintessence that can be achieved through having people directed towards the same purpose. So rather than pulling areas of possibility from nature in the form of a node or pulling from the vigor and drive of the market to get primal utility, this person uses the unity of purpose that creates communities as a source of quintessence. And it's just a small vocabulary change. And from that, a whole system fell out the other end. So yeah, big fan of coming up with alternate terms. I felt like there was a point in late revised where it got a little bit messy, where they would have the traditional, the mystical, and the technomantic term, and they didn't have an overarching term yet. So you kind of had to remember 2 sets of words and so on. But yeah, big fan too.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I like that celestial chorus reference and the thought for accessing Prime that way. I really like that. I want to write that one down after the episode. Well, Terry, you had a lot of really good notes on the different sections of this book, and so I'd just like to turn it over to you. Talk our listeners through the different parts that make up this Iteration X convention book.
Sure. Whenever I do a book read through, I am reading for 2 things. 1, I am reading for the podcast, and 2, I am reading to update the wiki. And the Iteration X page on whitewolf.fandom.com was particularly hurting, so I kind of went through and had somewhat detailed notes as I went through. The opening fiction is a raid on Greylock Chantry in the Northeast. So I think it's the New York-Connecticut border. And Greylock Chantry comes up a few more times. It's an SOE stronghold. And in it, a character is going for the next rank, as it were, within the convention. And they are participating on this raid on the Sons of Ether Chantry. And the character, William Smith, is going through and participating in this raid, comes against various difficulties. At one point is electrocuted. The computer in the agent's head is deactivated. And for the first time in a while, that character is capable of free and independent thought. And that character starts thought printing or writing down and recording the heretical thoughts that person is having about Iteration X and the technocracy as a whole. Eventually, their computer reboots, starts recording it again, and the character is trying to get out essentially as much as possible before the automated report of what they were thinking is submitted to their superiors for consideration. So in this opening little bit of fiction, you very much get both sides of the convention. of you have this character who was a thalidomide baby who had severely stunted limb growth, who was given this 2-meter tall hit mark body where they have a thermal lance and a chain gun. But on the flip side of it, they have a thing in their head recording everything that they're thinking, making them the only convention where it is very directly possible to notice their members committing thought crime, as in violating the rules of the group merely by what they think. And the rest of the book kind of follows from those two starting points. It goes through the history of Iteration X having started with the first person to use a tool. It also has an interesting mention that Iteration X considers its oldest rivals to be the dream speakers, which philosophically makes sense. But one of those things, again, I didn't really think about until I read through it again. Next, there's a section of opinions on what they think of other groups, what they think of other conventions and other supernaturals. It goes through a whole bunch of effects. It goes through a whole bunch of focuses. And then we get the section on the end on technocratic beasts, characters, locations, and so on. So it follows pretty well the same script as the Progenitor book, but on the whole, I think it implements it better. One of my favorite aspects is it's kind of a throwaway thing, but there are these binary blobs in certain areas where there are little 8-character binary strings. And something you can do now that you couldn't really do then is highlight that text in the PDF that you get from DriveThruRPG or whatever. Please, people, don't pirate these games. And drop it into a binary converter, and it gave you little text bits. So as I was going through, I was copying those little paragraphs in binary, plopping them into a binary converter, and getting that extra 2 sentences or what have you of the thoughts going through this technocrat's head. And that was kind of a cute little Easter egg. So things I couldn't do in 1995 when I read this for the first time.
Well, I would certainly second your opinion on when you said that the Iteration X book is similar to the Progenitor book in what they were trying to do, did just better implementation. And yeah, I believe that the author, Chris Hind, was trying to follow the same format. He was trying to accomplish roughly the same thing and go in the same direction with it. But he brought a little more thoughtful material to it. There was a better execution. When I look through the second half of the book, which is systems, rules and resources like that, I just got the impression that this is a more intelligent approach to possible foci. This is some nicer rotes that can be used. And of course, this was before they renamed rote. Just some nicer stuff presented to the reader, just a better job of handling this format.
And one of the ideas brought up originally in the Progenitors book was that technocrats had kind of direct access to quintessence from people, in that you could hook someone up to a machine and slowly drain their life force and get quintessence out the other side. In this book, it is suggested that anything that erodes human will can similarly do the same. One of the ways that Iteration X harvests quintessence from people is by forcing them to do repetitive tasks. So the idea that like rote learning in a public school or something is just a large quintessence factory kind of made me chuckle.
One of the reasons, or not reasons, but one of the things I notice is, those who've been listening to past episodes know that I talk about myself as a rules light guy, and I like to keep the rules, lighter, less detailed, so I can have more versatility. But this is one example of my philosophy, being a possible trip up. When I look at later editions of Mage, they are more rules heavy, they are more detailed, but I think there's a better approach to things like harvesting quintessence. When I look back at first edition, I see just conflicts in how this works. I mean, this source says if you want to get quintessence out of people, then you have to do a high-level vulgar effect that causes terrible damage to them and quickly kills them, and you get a little bit of quintessence. And then you look at just a little bit later, you say, the technocracy has these devious devices that pulls quintessence out of people. And then you get to Iteration X, it's like, if you get a bunch of people in a room and really bore them, you can pull out the quintessence. It's like, wait a minute, guys. How does quintessence really work? Because this matters a lot to the setting of Mage the Ascension. These mages are doing just about anything dark and devious to get their hands on some quintessence. And so how you get it, it matters. Can we please just agree on how do you get this stuff?
I am fine in cases where either interesting specific examples are brought up, or a new rule reveals that there is kind of a broad principle underlying a whole bunch of different uses, and they're just enumerating it in different ways. I tend to be I don't want to say I'm a rules-heavy person. When it comes to social interactions, I tend to default to role-playing, and if something goes bad, then we bring out the dice. But I feel like I'm the person who has a 7-course meal and then declines dessert because they're trying to watch their calories or something like that. Like, at the end of the day, yes, I want the 700-page rule book, but mostly so I can ignore some of them and be like, no, we're doing real role-playing. So I tend to be on the other end of the spectrum when it comes to that. And future editions do a much better job of harmonizing all of those things. It makes me curious. Like, so you and I are talking over Skype about a book about technology from 25 years ago. You were reading the Dead Tree copy. I was reading it on a tablet in bed, and I could just select passages and plop them in. It is interesting to see the progress of technology as we read books about the progress of technology. And I feel and that brings up the commentary I think you had before, where one of the problems with Technomagic is the fact that it has Moore's Law, and no other mystical endeavor does. There is no Moore's Law for wands. And how do you actually portray that in a system? So it seems like there's always going to be this frontier of technology that almost has to be vulgar. Otherwise, the technocrats are going to run away and win.
Yeah, unless your wand has a really little bitty etched-on message, Harry Potter TM, then, it's going to be better.
I am perfectly fine with the Harry Potter movies. They're delightful. They're enjoyable. I've retitled all of them. Like, there's Harry Potter and the Contrived Plot Device. There's Harry Potter and the Discovery of Privilege. There's Harry Potter and the Realization that Relationships Require Work. Harry Potter and the Scenic Tour of Places to Go Camping in the United Kingdom. I thought they were fine. And all the people that have very strong feelings about the books versus the movies, come at me. It is interesting, though, to talk about in the interview we did with Matt Webb. He felt it was very important to, at all times, have an into the game mage based on what the dominant cultural items were. He thought it was now important to say, hey, what is the group in mage where people who are super into Vampire Diaries or Vampire Academy, or who are super into the Dresden Files can get into the game. And as you pointed out, like, what was big in the mid-90s? Killer robots. What's this book about? Killer robots.
Yeah, people who enjoyed... I think this was not long after the second Terminator movie hit the theaters and caused a big wave and reminded everybody how much they liked the first Terminator movie. And I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list of movies, but there were similar ideas out there. The first Terminator movie, 1984, is mentioned in an Easter egg in this book, and it had a big effect on science fiction. Suddenly, there were tons of role-playing games and comic books about metal marching men and how cool they looked and what cool weapons they had. And it's easy to see Chris Hines saying, "Well, I know what a lot of those teenage readers are going to like. I'll just drop that in."
And I am entirely fine with that. And these things get nods in the mentions and sources sections towards the end. But it is interesting also coming back after 25 years and picking up all the Easter eggs that I did not pick up as a kid. What was you had one esoteric one that I had no idea where it came from.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's talk about some Easter eggs here. I'm looking at page 60. This is in the systems back half of the book, and it's talking about the, hit mark 4, and talking about how it's slightly older and giving way to the hit mark 5. Under hit mark 5, it says first application, AD 1984. That's the same year that Terminator 1 was in theaters. Maybe there's a connection there, just grasping at straws there. But also higher up on the page, under the description of the Mark IV, which is supposedly just being phased out, it says here, first used in 1953. They are in the process of being phased out. However, model number 521B remains unaccounted for. And I was reading through that. It's like, okay, that's an Easter egg, because there's no other mention of 521B anywhere in the book. And I can only make a guess. I'm going to assume that is either a reference to the Will Smith I, Robot movie, or which deals with robots, one of which goes renegade, or it is a reference to the Isaac Asimov science fiction short story that Will Smith's movie was based on, and Asimov was writing in the 1950s. And it's about a robot that breaks away and wants to become more human and arguably succeeds at the end of the story.
Yeah, the iRobot movie came out in the 2000s at some point.
Yeah, you're right. Can't be a reference to the movie then. Perhaps, I'm going to guess it's a reference to the Isaac Asimov short stories. You listeners out there, send in a message to magethepodcast@gmail.com and let me know. how wrong I am.
And as we all know, Isaac Asimov's first law of robotics is you don't talk about the laws of robotics. So, yeah. There was also
that was Robotics Club, right? Or
yeah.
something like that.
There was also the 1953 movie Robot Monster, and I'm super hoping it was actually a reference to that because this has some quality B movie attributes to it. I think a link to this on IMDb deserves to go into the show notes. Do you want me to talk about the organization and the groups, or start with another section?
Oh, well, I wanted to start off talking about some of the weaknesses. As much as I enjoyed this book, there were some things in here that I thought detracted from it, at least from my perspective. So I thought I'd mention that.
Sure.
And one thing that stood out to me the most was just like the first Progenitors Convention book. I just feel like they were trying too hard to make them look evil. In my opinion, they just put a little too much effort into it. They could have, reduced that effort a bit and given us something a little more even-handed, a little more food for thought. But this book was written in early first edition, and so the thought was this is not going to be a player's guide that characters can pick up and say, I'll try something from here. It was supposed to be, hey, storytellers, when you're sending Iteration X villains against your players, here's some stuff to think about if you're going to have conversations with them. Here's some weapons to put in their hands and ways you can handle that. And so because at that point the technocracy was seen as 100% villain, there's a lot of material they put in here that tries to make them look as evil as possible. For example, they're heartless, they're harsh, they're unfeeling, they treat their own people worse than you would treat your enemy. There's micromanaging to a degree that is, I think, a bit exaggerated. And as I was looking through this, I just thought, look, if there was really a group that took these ideas to these extremes, they would not be very effective, and I wonder how long they would even last in the dangerous world of darkness. So, yeah, as a storyteller, I tend to turn down the knob a bit on some of these things just to make it more believable for me and a little bit more interesting for some of my players.
Yeah, one of the things that pops up in a few of the books is the failure rate, or the washout rate at which people go through the process of becoming enlightened or awakened entities. And they particularly mention here when they're going through the ranks of Iteration X that of people who get to the rank of being a cipher, which is kind of the first one where you're on the inside, 80% complete deciphering, and of those, 40% survive assay. And you're like, wow, only 32% of people who walk in the front door are going to walk out the back. That's pretty selective.
We'll compare this also with the fact that in early first edition, they really emphasize how there aren't many mages in the world and everyone's trying really hard to get them into their group. And then you wash out 60%? Hold on.
And maybe that's one of those things where someone doesn't focus on the numbers and they're very much going for the idea that either being a mage is super difficult or that this is an absolute meat grinder. But that question is one that always occurred to me. We're not far from the original Hermetic book that indicates that mages are roughly 1 in 5 million. And at that rate, yeah, that represents a lot of unenlightened grist to go through the mill to get one mage to fall out the other side. I kind of bristled too against the part where they talk about how overscheduled it is. It is perfectly reasonable to me that Iteration X could be a little bit of a exaggeration of the most punctilious or the most on-time person you know, but it seems like that knob was cranked up a little more than would make sense.
I think they really wanted to go with the stereotypical mindset of the very focused engineer, some of whom I've met in real life, and they want to say there's an absolute zero tolerance for failure. And as a mage fan, I was reading through this thinking, well, okay, I can see wanting to emphasize that mindset and have that kind of villain in your game, but I like to bring up the fact that the technocracy is defining reality. They are taking their concepts of hyper science and trying to slowly bring it into the real world and the dominant paradigm. And in that process, you're going to have your people who are helping you do that failing. There's going to be screw ups. There's going to be paradox because this is, you're bringing some idea or some machine in that's totally new. And so if you're unforgiving of mistakes, how far is your group going to get in this endeavor? I think that's worth mentioning.
And it's an interesting contrast to the Progenitors who, if they're using genetic processes to improve all their stuff, they're entirely depending on failure, preferably of the random kind, to find that next generation that can be slowly improved. I mean, their name is Iteration X. You figure there'd be something that would kind of suggest that they are getting better and better at producing those tools rather than starting out the gate, hey, this is the level of precision that we're shooting for. Or it may be one of those things. I could certainly see a storyteller saying, okay, this is the line that's coming from the people at the top, but when it gets to the front lines, things get a little sloppier. But at the same time, it kind of cuts through this in that if an agent has a data feed shoved in their head and their bosses are always able to see what's going on in a way that no other convention has, that maybe the difference between how things are working in the corner office or at the top floors is contrasting with what happens when boots are actually on the ground. And I guess that gives you an avenue, but yeah, there seems to be more tension there than I feel like a plot could actually hold. So I will fully agree with you on that one.
Yeah, when you mention that, I remember a quotation from science fiction author Isaac Asimov, who was actually an author of a lot of nonfiction books teaching people, especially American students, about science. He said, most scientific discoveries and breakthroughs come not when a scientist in a lab says, "Eureka!" but when he says, "That's funny." Yeah. And yeah, I think that illustrates that so well. It's like, hey, some of these mistakes are going to give you really valuable information, so think about that. Also, I felt like Mage is a game of big ideas, and it's not just the Council of Nine Traditions that has these big ideas. The Technocracy has plenty of their own. And I just felt there was not enough mention of the philosophical side of Iteration X. What are their there were just sketchy mentions of what they want to see for the future, and they were purposefully written to sound menacing. It's like, give me a little more philosophy of what is their ideal society like, what is the perfect world that they're working for, and take a break from the menacing undercurrent for a minute and just, tell me what might they really embrace and get motivated by and get excited about.
It's certainly a case where to fill in those gaps seemed like it required a certain amount of creativity from the reader. And again, It's one of those things where I see the direction where the system eventually goes, and I am backfilling and saying, oh yeah, obviously there's this upside or there is this implied philosophy. But I only say that because it was made explicit in later versions. To my mind, there are 3 or 4 passages that were some of the few meteor bits. There's a line early on that I really liked of the masses call it coincidence, technocrats statistical inevitability, mages call it magic. And I thought that was just an interesting comparison of things.
Yeah, that was a neat line.
And William Smith is introduced as a character who has kind of drawn the short stick when it comes to biological destiny, being a thalidomide baby. And one of the explicit statements is Iteration X promises to make people whole. And there are 2 ways to take that. One is they promise to make people whole and they never deliver, which is the bad technocrat direction, or the Iteration X promises to make people whole, and they do, which is how they view themselves. And they mention this kind of weird idea in a couple of places where there's kind of this internal fight between, is the machine improving the person or is the person improving the machine? And to my mind, the very rigorous, boring way of putting it would be, no, the machine is strictly improving the person. The machine is reliable, the machine is repairable, the machine is exact. But they seem to mention in a couple of places the benefits of biological systems in terms of their resiliency and their ability to adapt and so on, which was kind of good to see. And it's one of those cases where there are people that very much hate the technocrats, and I think Adam and I are comparatively accepting of the technocracy. We're not going to say that they're going to be the true winners of the Ascension War, but if they wind up doing really well, there's a world that we can come up with that's a pretty nice one, and we're both perfectly fine with that. And to me, the technocracy is the person who put on hold their dreams of going to art school or becoming a professional performer because they needed to get a job to help pay a mortgage or to take care of a kid or to enter a trade to help support their community. That these guys are quote unquote the bad guys just because they're the ones telling you the rules, where at the end of the day, they're kind of the real heroes. And there were a lot of places in here where they talk about the benefits that the iterators have brought. And I felt like that was kind of the first case where that theme became obvious to me. Iteration X is full of people that had dreams, but ultimately decided to become plumbers because they wanted to do something useful. They needed to pay the bills, and application of this talent or technique was kind of the best way to do it. But that's a little bit out there.
No, I don't think it's that far out there when talking about Mage. I think that's I like how you put that. I was going to take that a little bit farther, but perhaps a bit later in the episode. I was talking about weaknesses, and so I just wanted to round out with three more detailed flaws that I found paging through. Page 65, we get to hear about an NPC named Texan, who's sort of a lower-level supervisor of a Iteration X construct. And we see that he has a paradox flaw. Everything he touches changes from inorganic matter into organic matter. And I was like, okay, now here we have a good example of early first edition paradox flaw that would itself cause paradox if it was among sleepers. And so it's like, okay, we see more of this in first edition. We see less of it in later editions. And we had a paradox episode or two here on Mage the Podcast where we get into the weeds on that one. So I'm not going to spend more time on it right now, but interesting to see that. And there was really this strong idea of the technocrats have this control freak mentality where if they can't predict something or something goes wrong or something gets out of their control, they're just going to have a fit. And honestly, I felt like that angle works better for New World Order. I think it fits and really finds a good expression there. But when applying it to Iteration X, it's I think a little less effective and less interesting, at least for me. Let's see, there are some NPC write-ups for programmers and comptrollers. We'll tell you about those when we hit to the ranks. Basically, these are higher level Iteration X mages. And just looking at their stats, I thought they were just too powerful. It's like, look, if my players had to face off against this guy, they'd be swatted like flies. So I'm gonna adjust these numbers.
The closest thing I can think is just because of their washout rate, there's so few of them that they can get away with being powerful. But especially as we found out going through the chaos factor, sometimes they're just first edition books where the sense of balance is not quite there. In terms of systems, I had the same response to Texan's paradox flaw, in that paradox flaws generally shouldn't deliver more. I am fine with that on the small scale. I am fine, for instance, with a character who is always cold, or I think my favorite one is their hair always blows the opposite direction of the wind. I am fine with little things that may not be immediately obvious. Yeah, the systems weren't as tight as one would want to do. They do a pretty good job of introducing the ranks and very clearly having an idea of what the hierarchy is. And it's kind of interesting because they introduce the idea of Autocthonia, and this is, I think, the first text where we kind of get a detail of what it is. And you had made mention of their level of precision, and I feel like one of the struggles within the book, sometimes it's played for dramatic tension, and sometimes it just comes off as inconsistency, is the divide between the academician and the engineer. Of one considers a very good application of their job to be the precision of being able to have a process work to 6 decimal places, and the other one considers precision the ability to act and react on the fly. And they kind of have that weird back and forth there. And the same thing happens when they discuss their two main realms. You have Mecha, which is just, that's MECHA, all caps, which is just this hellish prison realm where humans are ground down and quintessence is just repeatedly harvested from them. And then you have Autocthonia, where the computer lives, the leader of their convention, which I find is interesting. They're one of two conventions that kind of has a key figure at the top, the other one being the void engineer in the form of Tychoides. And their technology is everywhere. It is this techno-organic merger, or at least simulacra of life, brought to you from technology. And they make reference that it is not a rank so much as it is a privilege merely to be there. And I liked, again, that dichotomy between these are the benefits that implementing our vision can bring, and this is the hellish world that can also be created by the same vision. The only thing that, I don't know if this was just a case where it hadn't been established yet in Metaplot, but they mention a event that they take place in 1453, and they completely skip, I think, the convention of the White Tower in 1325. So they have this extensive prehistory where they talk about how the artificers were big in Greece and China, but maybe it was just the case that the metaplot hadn't been established or the history hadn't been established yet, but I saw no mention of the convention of the White Tower.
Generally, I liked the history on this one. As I've said in the past, when coming to tradition books or convention books, the history section is one where I kind of tense up, and it's like, okay, how cringeworthy is this going to be? And this one wasn't so bad. for me. I don't think they tried to do too much goofy humor or oddball ideas, and I like this fact of a technomancer group saying, "Hey, we're not as new as all that. We've been around since ancient times," and they give you some information. It's like, well, okay, it's so sketchy that is this kind of retconning and backfilling and trying to make yourself look more legitimate, or is there something real here? And for me, that's interesting. It's like, it could be either way. You can work with that in your own chronicles.
They have a whole smear of unawakened agents, which they divide into 3 classes. You have the rank and file, which are just mundanes. And the best example of this are probably the thugs they use. And they comment on how it is often more effective to shut down a tradition's operation through very mundane means than ever invoking any higher technology than having a bunch of brutes hang outside of a chantry or an operation that's run theoretically by a tradition mage and just kind of driving it into the ground. And that was a case where obviously it's been there the entire time, but when I read it, I'm like, oh, wow, that is pretty clever. That works surprisingly well for the Clockwork Convention. In addition to that, they have the professionals who come up with new ideas or at least distribute them to the masses, and technicians. And it was interesting because they brought up the theory that Iteration X overly complicates technology so they can kind of create a priesthood of people with privileged knowledge to improve the dependency of the masses on the convention. And again, that goes in how did I miss this on the first pass? And so those are the unawakened members. Once people are kind of introduced into the group as a whole, they become ciphers. They go through an 8-month intensive course of learning about the operations of the convention and how the principles of maybe what enlightened science look like without too fine a point on it. And as mentioned before, 80% complete that. Then at the end of it, they go on something called the assay, which I think is the most menacing way I've ever heard the term assay said, with a capital A. Like, as someone who spent a fair amount of time doing chemical assays, it'd be like, you must perform the assay. I feel like that's their way of saying you must now endure the crucible. And that is some sort of generally dangerous mission where they need to do something big. Traditional chantry raids is probably the most common one because it's brought up at least twice. And those who survive become an armature. And they mention that armature is a rank that do not hold a lot of people, in that most people tend to get promoted out of it, and maybe the fact that they spend so much time rotating through the shock corps, the group that is that group of hit marks that you just kind of drop out of a helicopter to rain down fire and brimstone on an area, maybe they don't have the longest careers, maybe they don't quite make it to retirement, maybe they really need good health and dental benefits, and it's for people who don't wish for promotion or prefer hands-on work. And above that, you have programmer. They are the group at which you are now in charge of educating other people. They're the ones who are in charge of deciphering. Above that, you have controller or comptroller, and each construct is controlled by one or a group of one. And it is interesting that they explicitly mention that they are all in communication with one another, which I thought was neat because, again, they mention the fact that one of the weird recurring themes in Mage is the bad guys are the only ones who can actually cooperate well. And this is another case of they're going to be portrayed as the bad guys. These guys are super in contact with one another. They have monthly parties. They always remember to send each other Christmas cards, probably entirely in binary, but nonetheless, the bad guys are the only ones that really know how to get along. And above that, you have anyone stationed to Autocthonia, which is this realm that exists on a planet that is opposite Earth, so it is never visible, and that is where the computer, capital T, capital C, lives. The name Iteration X comes from a self-improving algorithm that after a certain number of iterations, which is kept secret, which makes no sense to me because if you run an algorithm, you would just run it until this effect occurred again. Who cares about the number of times it needs to be run? How is that a secret? Anyway, where this computer lives that guides the entirety of the convention. And ultimately, all instructions that frontline iterators do come from a controller or come from the computer. That programmers have very limited ability to deviate from what they've been told. At the beginning of every day, they get a download of what their tasks are for the day. So when you think of top-down group, this kind of wins in terms of that. So that is the hierarchy of the convention, at least.
I saw the programmers as not just low-level leaders, but also skilled specialists who are mages, by the way. To become a programmer, you have to be a mage or technomage. And then I thought it was interesting how it mentions how those in Autocthonia have sort of higher status and more influence, but it's not a formally recognized rank. It's one of those informally recognized ranks. Like, this is not on the list, but we all know that those guys in Autocthonia have a lot more pull. And then at the top you have the computer, which actually makes me think of that early 80s role-playing game Paranoia. They have a quote from there in the book: "The computer is your friend." It's like, oh, okay, I see what you did there.
Yeah, certainly a product of its time. And I thought that we didn't get the explanation of what the computer actually was until much later. You and I months ago were talking about this, and I thought it was something that was only described later in the revised Iteration X or the Guide to Technocracy or something. But the computer is actually this giant globe-spanning umbral entity that embodies the notion of tool usage. And that this realm was found, the iterators started fixing it up and shining it up, and this spirit of tool saw it as the first thing, this giant mega computer is the first thing big enough to hold it. And it's kind of interesting. This is one of the few connections we have to the Exalted timeline, where Autocthonia is also a region there, has somewhat similar ideas in terms of being largely mechanical, being this giant enclosed space. And I just wish one day we had gotten the big book of here are emergent themes that cross over between Exalted and Mage, so I could have yet another system that I could buy 300 books in and never play. He said, pointing to all the vampire books behind him.
Yeah, I actually fell into that flaw. I did buy a number of Exalted books back in the day, read a lot of them, most of them, and I started up a Chronicle, and after like 4 sessions, it fizzled. And I was like, man, I couldn't get another one going. But yeah, definitely a flaw in us gamers. Talking about the computer with a capital C, yeah, that's mentioned on page 55. And I remember that conversation you and I were having earlier. I had this sort of weak memory at the back of my mind of this shady computer that wasn't well understood. And then I read this book and I was like, oh, okay, well, I was just wrong, because here on page 55, it is explicitly spelled out. It says, yep, this is an Umbrid of the Umbrid rank of Lord, which is pretty high up on the scale of Umbrid capabilities. And this Umbrid Lord has been around for so long, and it's been less interested in the Umbra and more interested in the physical world and the humans that live there. And it has been influential in subtle ways about tool use and technology and organization. And when Iteration X had a large enough computer, it inhabited it and took over the technocracy and said, I'm calling the shots now. And by the way, I like my privacy, and so we're going to hide all this information. And I thought it was an interesting idea, and they try to use that to explain why Iteration X is not allowed to know or teach their new recruits the sphere of spirit, which is later called the sphere of dimensional science, later on after this book. Although I like the idea, I felt it was not very well handled. I like the approach in a lot of other books, and actually from Anders' Mage page, whenever Anders Sandberg himself was writing up some new idea, he would use this regular way of explaining things. He would say, some people say this, some people say that, and a third group says the other thing, and people aren't sure what's going on here. And it was just such an interesting way of giving not only different ideas to a potential storyteller, but also letting the storyteller know, hey, is your chronicle, do it your way. And here in Iteration X, it just lays it all out very solid. It's like, okay, this is how it is. It's an Umbrid, it's a Lord level, and it did this at this time and this way. And I felt it would have benefited the readers in their chronicles a lot more if they had kind of hinted at one thing and then given a conflicting story and then said, you know what, it's your chronicle, you're going to pull out maybe even a third option.
It is interesting the extent to which, over time, books tend to turn into holy texts, where people will literally cite chapter and line against one another on internet arguments. And boy, howdy, am I certainly guilty of this. I literally bought the Vampire the Masquerade revised Clan Ravnos book so I could yell at someone about how they were fundamentally using chemistry wrong with changelings. And then when I was done, I was like, ha, look at me. Look how smart I am. And then 20 minutes later, I'm like, ha, look at me. Look how lame I am. I certainly like when there's at least asides that say, hey, there's a couple ways you could run this. I fully understand from maybe White Wolf's point of view that those things can become baggage that you have to that you have to be able to propagate forward, that when I can see them wanting to avoid cases where a player says, well, in this original supplement, you said that there were 2 interpretations, but in this later book, there's only one. Can you give us a supplement giving it from the other point of view? And you're like, ugh. It does make me curious, though, in that you have Control as the leader of the convention. Pardon me, the computer is the leader of the convention. Control as a concept hasn't yet been introduced. The idea that there is this giant technocratic entity that kind of controls all of the conventions and what they do. So my question then becomes, okay, what is the interface between the computer and Control? Does Control know about the computer at this point when it's introduced? Is there some sort of liaison?
Yeah.
Who knows? And it also makes you think, how many other conventions are actually just secretly being led by an umbral lord of some sort that is just being much more insidious than the computer? The thing about the computer is, it is a much more materialized or embodied spirit than a lot of the other ones. It is technology. It sits in a computer. You can point at the computer. A lot of umbral lords are not nearly so material that they are.
Down.
Yeah. So I wonder if there was a point where they were thinking maybe everyone has a dark, shadowy leader that is actually this weird otherworldly thing. And I feel like that eventually came into the idea of the technocracy having been infiltrated by the Nefandi.
By the Nefandi, yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious the extent to which, when we get Technocracy Reloaded, if any of those questions will be answered, and if there will then be a Storyteller Vault supplement of the Technocracy Reloaded, Revisited, Revised that will go through all these other options that I kind of wish existed for the Technocracy campaign I have never run and probably will never have the time to do.
No, they're going to call it the Technocracy Relocked and Reloaded.
Yeah, Reassembled Volume 2, Ariel's Big Adventure. I would totally buy it.
Yeah. Well, when talking about how the computer took over Iteration X and ran the show and was so effective that it took away one of their spheres successfully, my thought as a storyteller is, this doesn't make Iteration X look so good. It's like, oh yeah, we're less competent, we're less assertive, we're less authoritative. This being slunk in, took the driver's seat, told us how to do things, and directs everything we do, and we just love it. It's like they worshipfully look up for the computer and say, well, it's better than us. It's a machine. And it's like, well, okay, I can see how that could be cool, and you could get a lot of stuff out of that. And I'm not going to say that's bad. I kind of like some parts of it. And I like how it gives a possible Achilles heel to this convention that might look so sinister and unstoppable to other people. But at the same time, you have to realize that it can make the iterators look kind of childish, kind of incompetent. It's like, I'll just come in here and tell you all you guys what to do and what are you going to do about it. And like, okay. So it's worth considering.
There's a lot more conflicting themes, or a lot more juxtaposed themes, I feel, in this book than a lot of the previous ones. And the more I spend time thinking about it, the more that idea grows on me. That despite being the Clockwork Convention, this may be the one that has the most number of internal contradictions. They want to know all things and consume all, yet they are banned from this one particular thing. They appreciate the adaptability of the biological, but they are ultimately hoping to remove it. They want to create this clockwork future where everything is predictable, and periodically they wind up creating these digital hellscapes out of the downside of that option. So yeah, I can certainly understand that. The methodologies, I didn't find them terribly interesting. They introduced 3, and eventually we get a few more, where you have the statisticians, which they are the predictors. They practice psychohistory in the Asimov sense, the idea that history can be predicted, or what's going to happen can be predicted, predicated on 2 things. One, you're not trying to figure out what an individual entity is doing. You're just trying to figure out what society as a whole is going to do. And 2, that no one has access to psychohistory. I was a big fan of the Asimov Foundation series, which I didn't discover until I guess my mid to late 20s. And as I was going through, a friend and I were both reading it, and we just kept texting each other like, oh, so this is where this movie plot comes from. And oh, so that's the origin of this idea in science fiction. And it was just an impressive font of ideas. So strongly recommended if anyone's curious.
Yeah, I also read the Foundation series and its precursors, and you can definitely see a reflection of that in the statisticians, who are supposed to be the master planners and also the overall leaders. I mean, apart from the computer, but the leaders of the convention. You get a lot of leadership and influence from this group.
And as an actuary, I fully understand the wisdom and understanding of putting your statisticians in charge of things. The second methodology they mentioned are the time motion managers, where the goal of the statisticians is to predict and to come up with ideas. The time motion managers, their job is implementation. Advances that they come up with are given to the time motion managers to implement and hand off to other conventions. Their goal is design and overseeing construction. They are relatively limited in number compared to the other groups. And I guess this may be the group where the statisticians show a rigor of thought, the time motion managers show a rigor of action. Time motion management came out of a particular school of management that said the goal of management should be to break any task down into a repeatable process that can be performed with minimum thought and a maximum economy of effort. And that resulted in assembly lines where people kind of hated themselves. But at the same time, it also resulted in some pretty big upsides in the form of surgeries. The surgery at the time in the 50s and 60s, one of the problems was we didn't really have very good systems for preventing blood loss, for keeping people anesthetized safely. So one of the key skills you would have as a surgeon is a certain economy of motion. So the upside of this focus on that resulted in surgical practices that reduced the likelihood of somebody dying considerably. And this flows into the final group, the biomechanics group, which is very interested in the merger of person and machine. Ambroise Paré, pardon my French, is a progenitor turned artificer who is a historical figure who is generally recognized as creating some of the first good prostheses that aren't just a wooden replacement hand that is always in a particular shape. They mentioned the first hit mark as the first true cyborg coming out in 1984, which is interesting to me because in their history, they mention that nanotechnology was discovered in 1889. And it takes them well over a century before we get our first nanotech hit mark. I guess that's the Mark 6, the silvery liquid T1000-like entity that is coming for you and is remarkably difficult to destroy unless you're doing area of effect damage. And those are the group. I feel like it's a pretty clean breakdown, and they seem to get along relatively well.
Yeah, when looking at the methodologies, there were only 3, which is a little less than we see for many other groups in Mage and other World of Darkness factions. But it's a logical breakdown of what does this convention do? Okay, let's separate it out into groups. And I guess in that sense it works. Not terribly inspirational. But I saw the focus for time motion managers as these are the guys who run the production. These are the guys who make the weapons, the vehicles, the large machinery, and a pretty clear focus there. When you get to the biomechanics, it's like, okay, these are the guys who do bionics. These are the people who replace your arm with a mechanical arm or your eye with a mechanical eye. And, okay, so based on what this convention generally does, you can divide it up. What I thought was conspicuously absent was the computers, networks, internet, that sort of thing, because I see many mentions in other books and in Mage of how iterationx and the Void Engineers are quite active in the digital web, and they're good with making new computers and handling networks and writing new software that does all kinds of things. And it's just not mentioned here. And then I got to thinking, well, instead of making a methodology of iteration X that is about computer, software, internet, etc., I think it makes more sense to have a cross-convention group that has both the Void Engineers and the iteration X jointly together making this group. I think that'd be a cool idea. But again, there's not even a mention of it here. It's like there should have been. I'm just going to, if I can find Chris Hine, I'm just going to say, hey, love the book, but dude, can we talk?
Yeah, there's a certain extent to which they focus on the enlightened aspect of things. I'm not sure what a enlightened token ring network would look like at the time, or what an enlightened data storage system would look like that wouldn't already just fit into the generic hypertech. To me, that's almost like saying they never talk about which convention is in charge of housekeeping. I could certainly see an interest in going into it in more detail, but that it never struck me, probably because you're better at noticing these discrepancies than I am. But yeah, they bring up that they do all the high-tech stuff, but at the end of the day, they really have no discussion of who does the programming, who does the infrastructure, and so on and so forth, and left to the storyteller discretion, as it were.
Okay, well, before I come to the next section and sort of open it up and talk about more general themes and how they relate to Iteration X, I wanted to just do a brief rundown of how they've been portrayed through editions, especially early on. If you look at early first edition, and I'm talking early first edition, the real iterators were basically hidden. They were the hit marks, and the other agents of Iteration X were portrayed as creations of the iterators, not iterators themselves. They were, you might say, acolytes or mundane sleeper servants who knew a little bit more about what was going on technology-wise, but they were supposed to be the hit marks. And to even find an iterator and have a discussion with him or see him at his job was supposed to be something that you acquired after a lot of difficulty and was something to talk about to the other non-technocracy mages that you know. But we get into later first edition, and the iterators are the villains. The iterator mages are the hit marks, and they are villains that you go up against. They're a very sinister group, and they have a tunnel vision on their tightly defined goals. And then we get into second edition, and perhaps a little more later second edition, where the possibilities open up. One of the things Bricado did was he said, hey, there's not just one way to see the technocracy. There's a lot of different ways to portray this group. And, technology has done a lot of nice things for us, and shouldn't this be reflected in how we portray the technocracy? And so at this point, you have an Iteration X that is open to interpretation. It is placed firmly in the storyteller's hands. Do you want villains who are incompetent once you know their secret? Do you want villains who are hyper-competent? Do you want a mixed group, or perhaps even you want an idealized Iteration X that is leading us to a bright future, up to the storyteller in later editions? In my experience, both now and 20, 25 years, whatever, in the past, when I'm talking to people offline and online, this is the group that people love to hate. It works so well as a villain. Most of the people I talk to, they say, oh yeah, Iteration X, those are those uptight, tightly focused villains who are just the most stereotypical expression of the typical engineer. And they like to use them in their chronicles as villains, and I love it too. I've done that. I like to see that side of Iteration X, but there's other ways to see it. And it's interesting that in this book they brought out what a lot of people had been assuming about Iteration X already, and that's the stereotypical engineer. And in my career, in my background, I've met a number of these guys, and they have their upsides and their downsides. And the downsides, which are really emphasized in this book, are the tunnel vision, the very, very narrow focus. They are too direct, they're impatient, they have a love of simplicity. Now, I know that generally speaking, simplicity is good when you can take a complex subject and explain it simply. That is a mark of your research and your dedication. But when you have too much of an attachment to this idea of simplicity, you can lose sight of the fact that, hey, relationships are messy. The real world is messy. There are details that are not always going to fall into neat categories. And there are people in this world, and a lot of them are engineers, who really get tightly wedded to this simple view of the world, and they will happily ignore ideas and bulldoze over certain people and certain things at times in their dogged persistence in my simple view of things is great if you just keep to it. If you just hold to it, just follow me. So
I could see people attacking the iterators as being Procrustean in the traditional sense. So Procrustes was a myth of a person that would offer people free lodging at his place, but if they were too short for his bed, he would put them on a rack to stretch them out, which would invariably kill them. Or if they were too tall for his bed, he would chop off their heads, which would invariably kill them. And there is a notion in programming of a process being Procrustean if it deleteriously restricts data to a particular size, or deleteriously requires that the transit time for a network be exactly equal to something. It gets super messy and becomes problematic. The iterators are interesting in that they do bring up two fears that I don't think any other group does as well, which makes sense that a group would have a fear that it brings up particularly well. One is how alien machine intelligence could ultimately prove to be, that whatever a computer is thinking is not apparent to you. Even against the New World Order's mind games, you have an idea that you're going up against a person, so you at least know where they're starting from. But when a robot does something weird, did it intend to? Is that a glitch in programming? Is it just trying to mess with you? It's not nearly as apparent as when the agent that you're dealing with is another human being. And the other fear is of being replaced. I feel like a lot of social strife comes from groups who were formerly dominant, realizing that maybe that dominance was not earned or is not just to hold on to. But at the same time, no one wants to be replaced. I don't care how menial someone's job is. I don't think any of us want to be replaced by an unthinking, uncaring machine or be relegated to that level. So I think Iteration X does a super good job of bringing up those two very, I'm going to say basic, although I don't think cavemen really worried about being replaced, but I feel like those are foundational fears as we march even further into the 21st century. No one wants to be replaced, and no one knows what the machine is thinking. And I feel like a lot of our problems with algorithmic implementation and social media and so on come down to that second point. How did this result come up? We don't know. We just have this giant regression that we're going to call artificial intelligence that spit out this result at the end, so we assume it's good because it has a 99.98% efficiency in matching. So
yeah, really good food for thought. And I would like opportunities to take those two notions, those two fears, and bring them into a game that involved Iteration X. Because Iteration X, as we've said in past episodes, they see this bright future where humans and machines, or technology, are going to be very directly merged, and not just a thought of a human using a lot of tools or using tools well, but like becoming one with their tools to become some sort of a better or higher being. And there are good possibilities there, and there are certainly bad possibilities there. And one of the things I wanted to just take a moment to talk to the listeners about is the Iteration X is so often and so avidly portrayed. I mean, as this group that has all these flaws and is going to do all this damage. But I think it can be very interesting in a chronicle to find a moment somewhere where you can present the the Iteration X's point of view to your players and say, just for a moment, try and see this from their point of view. I mean, me personally, I've been doing software for so many years, and I am continually amazed at these algorithms or functions that I write that run through a lot of steps and handle a lot of data and a lot of calculations. There's a lot of logical, if then, if or kind of things going on. And I know what information is being fed into these functions and what it has to do. And then when I run it, it's like it's instant. I mean, I know it's not truly instant, but it takes such a short amount of time that to me it appears to be instant. And I just wonder at that. It's like, my gosh, that's amazing. Now, I know human minds work different, and they can do levels of pattern recognition and other things that machines and computer minds, I guess you could say, cannot do. But at the same time, I just look at the speed of this calculation, the complexity, and how it happens faster than I really can snap my fingers. And that is something I really wonder at. And to try and take that and say, look, let's connect this to people. Let's make this a part of who we are, to have that not just as a tool we use, but part of who we are. It's like, yeah, I can get swept up in a vision like that and see the possibilities. And also not just the speed at which computers can run their computations, but when a machine, generally speaking, I mean, even a crude car, when it's damaged, it doesn't have to take months or longer to heal. You simply take out the part that's broken and you put in a new part that's fixed. And when you got the parts there, repairs are fast and simple. And it's so nice. It's so different from having to stop work and lay in bed for a couple of months while you heal. And so to try and take that concept and say, what if we made that a part of humanity's future? It's like, oh my gosh, you broke your arm, you've got this disease. Well, hey, look, we're going to take this out and put this in, and you're done. You go back to work, go back to play. It wasn't that easy, wasn't that fast. It's like I can understand the desire to make that a part of humanity's future. And then there's upgrading. It's like, look, the human body has been a certain way for a lot of years. And to look at machines and say, look, the machine is working this way, and this part needs a replacement. But you know what? Instead of putting in another part just like it, we've come up with a better part. It can run faster, it can run better, it can do these new things. And so we put this new part in, and the machine was better than it was before. And what about taking that idea into being human? What if you have a disease, and then when you recover from the disease, you're better, you're more improved, you have upgraded people. I understand the implementation can get messy, but just stop and think about that idea for a minute. What if people were upgradable on into the future? Century after century of upgrading and improving large numbers of people. What things could we accomplish? And so, okay, to make a long story short, with these three ideas, I can sort of put myself into that mindset of iteration X and see some of the possibilities here.
It's one of those cases where the upside and the downside are almost immediately obvious. That everything they say very clearly has two sides of it. Like, one of the statements that is used throughout the book is, or one of the sentiments expressed is, Iteration X hopes to make life less painful. And there are two ways of achieving that: by reducing things that cause pain, or by reducing our ability to feel pain. Taken in wildly different directions, they can spell very different chronicles. And it is nice to see a group where the contrasts are so obvious on the face. Did you ever read Blindsight?
I may not have.
Peter Watts. It's a book that asks the question, do you need consciousness to have intelligence? And his answer is no. And one of the reveals at the end, spoiler alert, is that the ship the characters are on has a crew and a leader, but most of the instructions that they have been given the entire time are actually from the artificial intelligence, from the AI running the darn ship, but they just have a captain as a figurehead because people don't like reporting to a machine. Mm-hmm. That alienness proves problematic. And the notion of upgradability, we have a biological entity, a biological concept of upgradability in the form of evolution, but evolution doesn't always give us the best way of going into the future. The book, The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, talks about how being neurotic was probably super helpful when we were dealing with random predators. The person who was super good at worrying could be key to a group's survival. We don't need that anymore. So he is perfectly fine with people who take lithium or some other agent to practice what he calls cosmetic psychopharmacology. Some people just drew the neurotic stick. That is a useless skill now. Why would we hold it against them to change their own biology slightly to give them vastly higher degrees of enjoyment in the everyday world, where some people would say, that person's doped up, that person's taking drugs just to feel better? His response is, yeah, they should. They drew the evolutionary short straw in being this high-strung person. Don't blame society on them being this way. It's a biological fact. If that person wants to change it, it's no different than getting a nose job. And it constantly amazes me that we talk about the superficiality, but stupid factual aside, people who get bust change operations to either enhance or reduce their busts are consistently rated as some of the happiest people. In terms of changes you can make to your body, a boob job is up there. It doesn't matter what direction it goes, but it is one of the things people do where they have the least regret. And as someone who just spent $2,000 for an electric bicycle, I hope I can achieve boob job levels of happiness out of this thing.
Okay. New expression we can use.
Boob job levels of happiness. Yep.
Yeah, the idea of evolution is going to improve people. It's an interesting idea to bring into the discussion, but someone could then say, yes, but evolution is a process that is not directed by human will. It's just something that happens to us, and later on, if we survive, we can say, oh, yeah, that was a good thing. It's interesting to say, hey, look, we can think and reason and talk now and come together and discuss things, and what if we want to direct our own evolution? Is that truly evolution or not? I don't know, a different discussion. But Iteration X is one of those groups that's saying, hey, don't let blind natural forces direct the improvement of humankind. What if we do it ourselves? Well, one idea I wanted to throw out there as a possibility for storytellers who want to have a scene in their chronicle where they have a thoughtful or possibly thoughtful discussion between players and iterators. And one possible flaw that a player could bring up in the general philosophical direction of Iteration X is, what about the possibility of confusing your tools with your goals? Perhaps it's possible for a player to say to an iterator, look, you guys are so amazed by your tools and so excited about them that you're getting your tools confused with your goals. Focus on what it is do you really want, and stop focusing so much on how you're going to get there. And this is a qualitative difference. This is something to talk about.
I love that you brought that up. I don't know if we're going to wind up doing reviews of core books, but the first mage book I ever got was 2nd edition. And in the stereotype section for the Celestial Chorus, I think talking about the virtual adepts, the line they use is, they confuse the instrument for the note.
Yeah, I've forgotten about that. It's a good one.
And I love that. I'm like, man. And I mean, I'm 11 or 12 at the time, and that kind of pithy pseudo profundity was big for me. But I think that's a super interesting thing. Like, why are you upgrading the computer? Because better computers are better. To what end?
Yeah.
But I do appreciate the fact that this convention book says we're doing this for this purpose. Other people don't see it, but our goal is to reduce pain, to improve people's efficiency, because so they can be better enabled to do what they want. But yeah, again, another one of those contrasts that this book is so good at bringing up. Sometimes they confuse the instrument for the note. And that kind of brings up that kind of ends all my commentary for the book as a whole. At least I do think there was a few wonky sections where they talk about the fight between the Verbena and Iteration X, or the Progenitors, where they say that they want people to spend more time in cities and not go outside. So the Verbena created car sickness. And that the technocracy countered with creating pollen allergies, that kind of stuff that was all over first edition. Just every time I see it, just makes my eyes roll.
Yeah. The what is it? The early World of Darkness really thrived on conspiracies, and I think there was kind of a trend with early first edition mage books to key into that and say, oh, this is a conspiracy, that's a conspiracy, and to toss a lot of them out there. And 25 years later, one or two of them might look interesting to a storyteller. They might want to run with it, but then a number of them look kind of clunky, and so it's like, well, yeah, I don't know about this one. Let's see. Looking over the book, another theme that was mentioned quite strongly in the book was the iterator's connection with China and Chinese culture and history of magic in China, in the world of darkness, not in the real world as much. But I thought this was interesting, but at the same time, I thought it was really cool that they did it, but I have a bit of criticism with how they did it. I thought it was interesting to say, look, technocracy and this approach to technology and thoughts of the future are not just a Western thing. Let's pull in some other parts of the world and some other cultures, and they pulled in China, and I thought that was rather clever, because you look at China now, and all of our talk about technocracy from the 90s can find an expression in a few things that are happening in society and government over in China now. And also, when you look at the typical, what we might call the stereotypical engineer's mindset, you've got a lot of very talented and very engineer kind of engineers coming out of China, a lot of whom I've worked with, really great guys, and women, of course, too. But this idea that at some point in, I don't know, the 1600s, 1800s, somewhere in history going a ways back, there were a number of artificers in China, and there were a number of artificers in the West who came into contact with each other, noticed each other, and to make a long story short, they said, hey, you think like me, we're brothers, let's get together. And I don't think it's so ludicrous and so ridiculous. I think that there are a number of, there's a aspect of Chinese culture that's going to produce a lot of people who think a certain way, and they're going to meet people who think in a very similar way coming out of the West and say, if we get together, we can do more, and we can work together pretty well. So that was cool. But when they tried to reach back into older Chinese cultural sources and try and kind of work it into Iteration X's current thinking and current methods, the fact that they drew on Confucianism, I think, worked really well. I think that was a good link. I think an iterator can read, in say an English-speaking country, can read the translated Analects of Confucius and say, yeah, this is old and it's from the other side of the world, but there's a lot of stuff in here that I'm picking up on. I can really see that. But one thing they did a number of places throughout the book was they took Taoism and Lao Tzu and his influential book, which has been translated many times into English, and said, oh yeah, Iteration X and Taoism, they're just a natural mix. And feel free to disagree with me. I'm certainly no authority on this, but I see how the Akashic mages are a natural fit with Zen Buddhism and especially Taoism. It's like the Akashics are going to read this stuff and say, yeah, this is our kind of thing. I have a much more difficult time imagining iterators looking at Taoism and saying, oh yes, this is what we're all about, and this is where we find the expression of our ideals. I really disagree. I think an iterator is going to read either Lao Tzu's original work on Taoism or stuff by his disciples and followers in later eras of China's history. They're going to read this Taoist material and say, no, this is not my kind of thinking. This is very imprecise. Most of these writings are wide open to many different interpretations, and the Taoists thought that was a strength and led to insightful thinking. But most iterators are going to have this mindset closer to what we would call an engineer's mindset. And they're going to say, look, I want something that I can apply, that I can explain easily, that other people are going to understand the way that I understand it, less open to interpretation and more action-oriented. You look at Taoism, and there was a lot of these statements of being less useful to society means society is going to leave you alone, and you can do your own thing and find your own, profound insights. And iterators are going to say, no, we are a big group. We are connected to society. We want to direct it or benefit it, etc. And this Taoist thinking is not something we're going to get excited about.
I have no commentary on that whatsoever. So great. My familiarity with Taoism is restricted to the single ninth grade course where we talked about it for about 4 weeks, plus all the books that have brought it up in various ways. The closest thing I can think of to sound somewhat intelligent is the fact that almost every group at every time is trying to prove that every idea is really theirs. So I can fully understand the idea that you have the three treasures of Taoism, of compassion, frugality, and humility. And you can say all of those are also goals of the iterators to a certain extent. So, sure. But yes, I am glad that you said that thing you know well.
I like to tie in a few ideas from Anders Mage Page when I find something particularly interesting. And if you head over to Anders Mage Page 2.0 and you look at the Iteration X page, if you click on Factions and then go to Technocracy and then Iteration X, it's not a terribly large page, but there are two gems on there I just wanted to point out. One is there's an article, one of the longer ones written by Anders, but not terribly long, called The Magic of Bionic Implants. And I thought that was a very intelligent approach to Technomagic and Mage the Ascension, and it specifically mentions Iteration X quite a bit. It talks about how, yes, the science fiction technology, the cool souped-up vehicles, and the bionic implants are cool, and we want to have these in our games, but this is not a typical science fiction role-playing game. This is not Cyberpunk 2020 or Shadowrun. Bionic should mean something more, and it should be a stepping off point for discussions of possible futures, benefits to humanity, philosophies, etc. And so a really nice article, and it has some story ideas at the end that are solid and may benefit you as much as they did me. Also, there is a fringe group, a spin-off group that Anders Sandberg invented that he calls The Core, and it fractured out of the Iteration X, and it is made up of mostly renegade iterators and renegade virtual adepts who got together and said, look, we are really, really serious. We are hardcore. We are dedicated to pushing the envelope and making man-machine interface more of a reality, whether it's bionic implants in people or like truly merging someone's mind with a large globe-spanning network and seeing what comes out of that. They want to, knock out the hindrances and rush towards that goal. And so it's seen as this group that both the Technocracy and the Council of Nine look at and say, boy, those guys are extremists. We don't like them. We're going to keep an eye on them, or we're going to try and stamp out this brush fire. But at the same time, it's interesting because the Core has so many ideas and they're doing so many real experiments that are going to appeal so strongly to both virtual adepts and iterators that it's attracting so many members to it. And I just read through that and I thought, oh my gosh, that is so cool. That is an idea of taking some real world thinking and dropping it into the world of Mage the Ascension and shaking things up.
And when it comes to people that you should trust for transhumanist research, Anders is kind of one of the go-to people out there. And it's interesting that you bring up prostheses because I remember I encountered one or two when I was a kid, but I have a few friends that are veterans and they left to serve their country and they didn't come back with all the parts that they left with. And in one case, there was a lower leg replacement that the person in question is like, I didn't know that prostheses had gotten so good when no one was looking. To me, it's kind of like VR, that just out of nowhere, it got reasonably good. So this seems to go in the class of things that within our own lifetime, it's going to go from magical item to mundane. And yeah. I'm jazzed about that.
Yeah, who wouldn't be? Well, let's see, just in passing, I wanted to mention one thing. In this book, it was not intended to be a player's guide. And so although they make it clear to us that this is one of the few groups that has one sphere they cannot use at all, like the Ali Batin, it does not give us their specialty spheres. It kind of vaguely mentions that, forces or matter would kind of work for this group. And hey, I certainly agree. If I was running a Chronicle and had a player who wanted to play an iterator, I would think about saying, okay, one of your specialty spheres is going to be forces or matter. Choose one. And for the other specialty sphere, you might want to choose that based on the methodology that interests you or the direction you want to take your character. And of course, don't take spirit or what you would call dimensional science. And so wanted to toss that out there. Now, before I get into a few of those adventure ideas that I thought up, I did want to mention towards the beginning of this episode, I was talking about how Iteration X is one of those groups that you love to see as a villains, and they work so well there that for me, it's really hard to resist, and I use it in that way in some chronicles. But I like to also consider Brocado's later direction of opening up the technocracy and saying, look, they aren't necessarily villains. We can portray these in other directions. And so I started thinking, how would I think about better iterators? How would I make them more idealists and less, draconian? And I have a few suggestions that storytellers can take or leave. One is when a iterator becomes a cipher, which is analogous to an apprentice, a mage in training. They're awakened, but not so powerful yet. They're given DEI, which is mentioned many times in this book. It's a machine called a digital enhancement implant that is physically implanted in their head, and it's a computer that's right there with them, and it is portrayed in the book as being a sinister thing that limits them, keeps tabs on them, reports on them. Now, for a more ideological Iteration X, we could say that when a cipher graduates to becoming an armature, he is given the option to change his DEI. He's given more control of it. He's asked for his input on, what did you think of it while you were a cipher and it was in your head? We're going to give you a little more direct control so you can adjust it, you can limit it this way and augment it that way, or just turn off some of the options and turn on some others. And then tell us what you think about it. How does that work for you? What are your input here? Because I think it's reasonable for all mages, all technomages, to look at other technomages and say, hey, you might think of something that I didn't. You might bring something to the table that I never thought of. And so I'm going to open up this DEI for you and surprise us. Tell us something nice. Also, what if the computer in Autocthonia was less of a dictator and more of an advisor or an oracle with a lowercase o, some sort of highly respected source of wisdom that they listen to and some iterators revere, but is not calling the shots. It's not the boss, and sometimes they disagree with it or wonder, maybe this is an idea that's ahead of its time, and in 20 years maybe we can get back to this. What about they're limited on the spirit sphere or dimensional science? They can't use that. Well, what if you tied that to their philosophy instead of just being a hard limit saying, that's scary, we're afraid of it, so we don't do it? What if it was connected to their philosophy? What if it said, hey, look, we choose not to allow our members to study this because we have a focus on this world. We see too many mages that wander off into the Umbra and never come back, or join the oracles and are never heard from again. As they increase in magic, they forget about the masses and move on to these loftier goals. We want to focus on the real world, on the masses, the sleepers. We want to be a group that's always going to be here, always going to benefit them and never wander off and get lost. And that's why we don't wander off into the Umbra. And someone's going to point out, you have all these constructs that are on the horizon, and so you guys do go into the Umbra. And I don't think it's so unreasonable for Iteration X to say, look, we are limited by certain factors. We want to be able to do good research. We have enemies that are after us. We have logistical needs. And so for the time being, yes, we do use these Horizon Realm constructs, but we are working towards a future where we're not going to use them and we're going to live side by side with the masses. And that is why we are not so focused on spirit. And also, hey, we started out as humans from this physical place we call Earth. And we don't want to study spirit because we don't want to get closer and closer to the Umbrood and take their point of view. We want to remain human and stay with these people. And that's why. So, okay, maybe some oddball ideas, but I just thought maybe it can be thought-provoking to tie in their limitation on spheres with their philosophies, with their goals.
I think a lot of those are perfectly reasonable. One of the ones that struck me as interesting about the DEI is I wonder to what extent the character would have difficulty telling the difference between their DEI and their avatar. We get the idea of the Eidolon as just being another voice in your head, and which is fine as one way of representing it. In M20, they say that characters no longer automatically get a DEI and that they have a VDAS or some other data feed that is ubiquitous. But I also think it would be important to point out the utility of having that thing in your head. I don't know how many times a person on the front lines with Iteration X is going to see someone someone reduced to a pile of organs by an entity from beyond reality, and having a little voice inside of your head that says, you're doing the right thing, stay focused right now, we understand that not everyone's going to make it back, stay on target, is ultimately going to save a lot of people's lives. And that the level of detachment that we associate with the iteration X as a convention is useful. That if your goal is to be a shock troop against the enemies of reality, the ability to forget about that or to turn it off is actually going to enhance your ability to survive, because you're not going to be curled up into a ball in crippling fear, and you're not going to be dealing with post-traumatic stress and so on. So I can certainly get behind that. I do like the idea of foregoing the spirit sphere as being a choice, in the same way that if someone chooses to go vegetarian or vegan, it's not like they lose the ability to eat a hamburger. They are merely choosing to refrain from it. It also makes me curious that Decillion is, 150, 160 years old?
Oh, yeah, NPC in the book.
I wonder how many very old iterators are from before the machine's ban on dimensional science. I wonder if there's some very old iterators that may be quite potent when it comes to that.
I didn't think of that. Yeah, some older NPC that knows this stuff and kind of keeps it quiet, but as the players interact with them more, it's like, hey, you know what? Let me tell you something from an Iteration X point of view. That could be totally cool.
But I thought the ideas that you brought up were entirely reasonable.
Yeah, last detail would be in a more idealized, better Iteration X is what if the Pogrom was a term that the Council of Nine thought up and uses because they're so upset about some of their mages being removed by Iteration X. But actually, what the Council of Nine calls the Pogrom is a legitimate effort by Iteration X to remove the dangerous renegades from the Council of Nine, who kind of break off and do their own thing and are really doing harmful things to society. And the Council of Nine is like, well, just leave them alone and they'll come around in the end. And Technocracy is saying, no, these guys are hurting a lot of people and we're taking them out of the picture. And of course, there's other legitimate threats, bad Umbra that come through and do cause problems, and real Nefandi who surface and are causing ugly problems. And so Iteration X removes those members, and then, of course, the Council of Nine calls that the Pogrom. So, yeah, just a possibility. I agree. They make excellent villains. They're fun to look at that way. Before I go into adventure ideas, just going to mention that in the final chapter of the Iteration X convention book, it gives us a construct of Iteration X, and there are some NPCs in there, some possible plot hooks, and I thought that this was a nicer presentation of a technocracy construct than what we found in the first Progenitors convention book. It gives us a more sterile, machine-like construct, but I thought they did it much better than in the Progenitors. It says, look, they took this horizon realm and they created this sort of windows into the Umbra that look like a big static screen, like from the older days of our analog televisions, not like now. And so, we called it snow on the screen. And so this way that they constructed this horizon realm, it's distasteful or even harmful, unappealing to Umbra. And so it's like, even though it's in the Umbra don't like to come here. They don't want to be here. And so it's just the iterators and their servants and their machines. And it kind of made sense. It was an interesting idea. It's like it puts it in the setting of Mage in a very technocracy way. And I just thought it was a better presentation. This construct would be something that I might want to pull into one of my games and have players go there and look around and see it and see how this is different from Council of Nine Horizon Realms. And it could be cool in a game.
Your idea about the iterators, the pogrom being actually the term the traditions use, provides an alternate plot that is kind of interesting. That one of the benefits of being a cyborg is, or being mostly machine, is comparative incorruptibility. You're not going to convince an iterator to go to go through the calls for want of power or love or lust or any of the traditional motivations that the Nefandi turn against someone. So I do like the idea of the iterators being an ultimate bulwark against that, in that you have this unfeeling, unthinking machine that is not fail to the failings of mortal flesh. And your comment about the snow area kind of reminds me of the opening line to Neuromancer of "The sky above the port was the color of a television tuned to a dead channel," and how poorly that's aged, in that on most TVs, if you just turn it to a blank channel, you either get bright blue or just kind of a random image that the TV has generated. So it pleases me that books on the future often fail in some pretty polite ways, but otherwise good insight.
Yeah, well, static has become an expression in our language so much, and I think that we're now reaching the point where the young people don't understand us older people, because I was at a auto mechanic place, and they had a TV running, and it was just totally low budget, and so it had a terrible connection to, I don't know, ESPN or something. It was trying to show a golf game, and instead of static, with the new digital broadcasts, the way that the image would distort from poor reception was quite different to the static that we all know from our younger years. And so, yeah, we've taken static to be a sort of a metaphor or expression. And I think in just a few short years, there's going to be a lot of people who look at us funny and go, "What are you talking about?"
The best descriptor of digital television I had heard was, it is like giving someone a car that they're only allowed to operate if it's in perfect running order. The moment there's a scratch, or it runs out of gas, or that a part is impaired, you take it back and they're not allowed to drive it until it's perfect again. It is either at 100% or it's at 0. And it's at 0 a frustrating percentage of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I was kind of trying to watch the golf game, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm giving up. I'm looking away because this is ugly. But anyways, getting back to Iteration X, I've got a few adventure ideas here. I've got 4 I wanted to jump into. I'm hoping some of the listeners will indulge me in this. There's got to be some listener out there who would like to hear this. And for that guy, I'm going to put down a few of these. First off, what if the players were to come across an ancient skeleton, either in a raid on a chantry or a construct or something that's just been discovered. And this ancient skeleton has platinum, actual metal platinum etched circuitry lines on the bones of this skeleton. And it's going to have a special significance to iterators. When iterators are near this thing, when they study it, when they look at these circuits and try to discern what they're doing, they get these flashes of inspiration for machines they could build, or especially for bionics that they could create or incorporate or improve upon. And it just becomes such a desirable thing. It quickly becomes something that iterators are trying to grab, or perhaps a construct will give you a story for its origins and make a claim on it, and they really want to have it. And mages, especially technomages that spend even more time with it, they get these flashes of insight, these visions of some sort of a giant city that they can only vaguely discern, but it appeals so strongly to them. Some giant city that works with amazing efficiency. And in this city, there are no humans, there are no machines. There's a sense of something that is a combination of the two, and has an amazing degree of precision and harmony and effectiveness. And when they have these visions, they have this rush of emotional feeling of like meaningfulness, of like desire for this possibility. And so, of course, this skeleton with platinum circuitry etched on it is going to become a MacGuffin. This could become a major plot device for your chronicle. Where did this come from? Who really made this? And what long-term effect is it really going to have on a group that keeps hold of it? And why is the New World Order so keen on recovering this thing and hushing it up? Second possible plot hook is, what if the iterators or other technomancers were just to discover a chantry or a construct of the group called the Core off of Anders' Mage page? They would come across this. Perhaps your Council of 9 players think that they're doing a raid on an Iteration X facility, and it turns out to be a facility of the Core. And this is recommended for your players if you have, I would say, 2 or more technomages, whether the VAs, Etherite mages, iterators, whatever. They come into this facility of the Core, and they are simply fascinated by what they find here. They find this amazing project that is integrating sleepers with machines and cutting-edge technology, and they're finding powerful results. These sleepers are not mages; they're not truly awakened, but they might as well be, because of all the amazing things that they can do and all the amazing things they're seeing. And so this becomes like kind of seductive. It's like even after the player group leaves, there's going to be hopefully 1 or 2 players that's going to be thinking, oh my gosh, I want to get back there and see what they were doing. What is their secret? How do they make this work? And then you can get into a question of ethics, indoctrination versus experimentation. Is it ethical what they are doing to these sleepers at this Core facility? Is this we're moving towards a bright future or a horrible future? And the devil's in the details. Let your players get into those details with this plot idea. Next up, what if there is a cabal of verbena who either develop on their own or capture from the progenitors a sort of rote or perhaps a virus weapon, and this would get into any person, any mage especially, who has bionic implants, whether a virtual adept or an etherite mage or an iterator, etc., and it causes just terrible damage and is life-threatening to anyone who has bionics. And so this cabal of verbena, whether you want to portray them as typical verbena or a radical faction, they believe that bionics are a blight on the world and they need to be removed, and they're going to unleash this virus, and it's going to affect so many in both the technocracy and even in the Council of Nine. And so this is a possible team up. Say there's a group of Iteration X mages who have the details on this or have some specific knowledge on how to counter these verbena. And then the players have the option. Are we going to team up with Iteration X? This is inconceivable. Could we even do this? Perhaps we need to. And as things progress, you can present to them the idea, well, who is the enemy here? Are the verbenas really that bad? Are the iterators that they're working with, are they really the enemy? Are they getting in too deep? How could this turn out? And finally, wanted to think of this possibility of bad implants that are coming from Iteration X. There are prostheses or other kind of medical implants for the general public that are coming out from Iteration X, and they're really having very harmful effects on people. This is something that the player characters have learned about, and they decide they've got to find an answer. And as they investigate, they get contacted by possibly a New World Order agent who is also working on this same case. And cooperating with the New World Order is something you've got to take very seriously. But in a pinch, this might be a necessary arrangement, short-term or long-term. The players find that the implants are coming out of a hidden faction within Autocthonia. And this faction has the agenda of truly replacing humanity with machines and artificial intelligence. They've decided that humanity is just a mistake. It's got to go. It is imperfect, and that is just not okay. And so they are working towards this future goal of true replacement of man by machine. And so the players have to infiltrate Autocthonia. They have to possibly work with the New World Order, see what they get out of that. And they are going to discover that this faction that wants to replace man with machine, does this represent all of Iteration X? Is this the true hidden agenda of the computer? Or is this some splinter faction that is existing inside Iteration X, but Iteration X doesn't even know about yet? The players could be the ones who crack this case open and help clean out Iteration X. So one idea for an epic chronicle that you could run that would involve all the elements of Iteration X. Hopefully somewhere in there's an idea that you can fix and make better for your chronicle. And when you do, you can let us know at magethepodcast@gmail.com what you've come up with and the cool stuff you're doing in your chronicles.
Follow us on Twitter at magethepodcast. And make sure you subscribe to us on iTunes. Visit us on Spotify. We're on Anchor.fm as well. The only additional plots I have to add to what Adam said were literally any sci-fi plot ever. Of the stereotypical sci-fi groups, Iteration X kind of wins for that. And that's really all I have to say about that. We've managed to do another episode, which is nearly 2 hours long, about a 60-page book. Yes!
Well, also, if you give us a review on iTunes, that not only lets us know what you're thinking, but it also makes us more visible to other people who are searching through iTunes for something new to listen to, and might just be the difference that lets them know that Mage the Podcast is out there and has some material for them to hear. So thank you so much for tuning in, those of you who made it this far through our 2-hour talk, and hopefully there was something there that can appeal to you and inspire you to do something interesting with Mage the Ascension, because I've certainly gotten a lot of fun doing that myself.
Get out there and iterate.
Well, until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
The executive producers for today's episode are Richard Bat Brewster and Ira Grace. Thanks a bunch. What's an executive producer, you may ask? It's someone who's decided to support the operations at Mage the Podcast with either a one-time or a recurring donation to improve our operations. You can find more information by looking at our show notes at magethepodcast.com and looking for the How to Become an Executive Producer link. Your donations allow us to improve our equipment, improve our software, and help us towards long-term projects. For instance, we're looking to do a bunch of recordings from upcoming conventions. If you would like to support us, again, please visit us at madetothepodcast.com and look for information about how to become an executive producer. Ira, Richard, thanks so much.